So welcome to the August meeting of the Kubernetes VMware User Group, which is about best practices and user interaction and feedback related to running Kubernetes on top of VMware infrastructure, which could be the server hypervisors or desktop hypervisors. This meeting abides by the Kubernetes Code of Conduct. The too long didn't read of that is be nice to people, treat them as you'd like to be treated yourself. And with that said, we'll kick this off. I posted a link to the agenda notes document. You can see the agenda there. I'd also encourage people to put their name in the attendees list. Sometimes people talk and would like to interact later, and sometimes with Zoom it isn't clear who was speaking. So if you put your name there, it helps others connect with you later, should they choose to. The agenda today, we're going to start, we originally had planned on having a speaker who couldn't make it today, Dan Finnerman, but Miles did a last minute attempt to learn the topic, and he's going to talk to us. In a way, I'm looking for, Miles and I were chatting over Slack, and he seemed a little nervous, but I think in a way it's great to see somebody take something on for the first time and learn it, because they can provide good feedback to the rest of us about what the experience might be like. So he's going to talk about kube-vip, a load balancer, and maybe a few other things. Mm-hmm. Then David Von Fennen is here to talk about the new version of the vSphere cloud provider that just came out, I think about a week or two ago, but he'll give you the exact details. Then finally, we're going to cover some of the recent CNCF conference activity. Just quickly, we'll give you links to a few things, but we gave a user group session at the Cloud Native China just a few days ago. And then we prepped our recorded talk for the upcoming KubeCon Europe event. So we'll talk a little bit about those, and then anybody else, we'll have if time allows, we'll just have an open table for any topics anybody wants to bring up. So with that said, I'll turn it over to you, Miles.
Cool. All right. So I'm just going to share the kube-vip website, because why not? Like Steve said, we originally had Dan Finnerman, who actually wrote this, scheduled to come on, but due to some other circumstances, he couldn't make it today. So I've made an attempt over the last 5 to 6 hours to learn this technology and try and deploy it so that I could tell you how it works. And I figured the easiest way to do that would be via cluster API for vSphere. So I tried that and ran into a couple of roadblocks here and there, which I'll go through. And I haven't managed to get kube-vip deployed because GitHub has rate limited my home IP address. So I can't actually deploy it to show you it because I'm being blocked by GitHub at the minute. So we'll just go through.
That's weird. I didn't even know they did such a thing.
Oh, apparently they do. You get an error too many requests and it just stops working.
Okay.
So basically what kube-vip is you can think of it as kind of like Metal Load Balancer. If you're familiar with bare metal Kubernetes, it's kind of like Metal LB, except Metal LB is just for services within the Kubernetes cluster. kube-vip is designed to do that, and also to provide a load balancer in front of the control plane node. So you can think of it as a replacement for HA proxy as well. So currently in KAP-V, we package HA proxy if you have multiple control plane nodes to make sure that the API server front-end IP is load balanced between those control plane nodes. And in KAP-V 0.7.0, which is in beta at the minute, it's not fully released, we've integrated kube-vip. So the reason for that is it removes a dependency on HA proxy, so it's another thing that we don't need to deploy. And it can do a dual purpose, act as the front end load balancer for your control plane node and act as your load balancer for your services as well. So playing with it, it is actually really nice. It's pretty slick. Some of the features in there compared to Metal Load Balancer are lagging a bit For example, there's no BGP support. So if you need BGP support, you can still use Metal LB. But kube-vip has a nice feature upcoming, which is it can just pull addresses from DHCP. So rather than having to supply it a static scope of IP addresses that it provisions from, and you allocate a block, you can just say, pass in an address of 0.0.0.0, and away kube-vip goes, and it'll use DH client to pull an IP address and then assign that as your service type load balancer. So there's no need to actually have reserved ranges and that kind of thing if you want to use kube-vip. So there's a bunch of bits and pieces in there. It's a really nice project to go and have a look at, particularly because you can use it inside and outside the cluster. And like I say, it's being integrated into Cluster API vSphere in the 0.7.0 release, which is coming out, I think, next week or the week after, sometime like that. It's currently in beta, so you can try it now if you want to. It requires that you give it a static IP address, but other than that, really quite simple to set up. But like I said, I've had some challenges because I didn't know what I was deploying. I was trying to deploy something with HA proxy and thought it was kube-vip, and basically I just didn't read the manual correctly. So that's about all I have on the kube-vip thing. It's easy to deploy if you already have a K8s cluster, but you can try it out with Cluster API if you use the 0.7.0 beta bits. I don't know, David, if you have any other bits and pieces on that as well.
No, nothing.
I had a few questions. Maybe you know these or not. And one comment, I guess, where you talked about Metal LB not being usable outside the Kubernetes cluster. Well, obviously, the whole point of the load balancer is to stand stuff up to use from outside the cluster, but you're meaning that things get hosted behind, the other side of the load balancer, right? And yeah. I know that because I've done this myself, if you take the load balancer and use it in conjunction with a service mesh, or at least with Istio, Istio is capable of providing mesh connections. It's called mesh expansion for legacy VM, or they don't necessarily even have to be legacy apps, but new VM services. And it's actually Istio acting as an intermediary, but it is possible to use pretty much any load balancer to connect non-Kubernetes cluster things if you use a service mesh. It's kind of maybe a heavyweight solution because you need far more than the load balancer, but you can put that together. But I'm wondering about this kube-vip kind of community health of how many people and organizations are behind it at this time. I'm completely new to this.
It's pretty fresh at the minute. I think it's only got 100 or something stars on GitHub. The main contributor obviously is Dan. It was his project. There are a couple of other people that are contributing to it now and seem to be quite active. So it is something that's growing, but I think it was only released a couple months ago. So it is still pretty fresh as far as projects go.
Okay. Yeah, because a lot of people were nervous about Metal LB's community health, just because anytime you have these kind of things dominated by one developer, it is kind of a concern.
Yeah, well, and Metal LB has essentially come to a standstill as well because the main contributors stopped contributing to it. So yeah, it's a valid concern to have. But that said, Metal LB is largely functional for most things that you want to use it for, and it's quote unquote good enough.
Yeah, it is a hot topic because this whole thing of standing up the load balancer for on-premises is a challenge. If you've got this big data center, if you're in a public cloud, obviously the cloud provider delivers that as a service and charges you for it. If you are on premises, if you're big, you might have like an F5, but what do you do when you're moving out there to edge or remote offices where you're perhaps not willing to spend the money to put the big hardware-based load balancer in place when your needs are light and you'd like a software-based solution? It's almost like it strikes me that there isn't a critical mass of everybody's gotten behind one solution, and there's kind of I don't know, maybe I've come across up to 5 of these things that, like I say, they're used here and there, but don't have a massive foundation support behind them with a huge number of users and developer contributors. But I'm going to take a look at this because I find myself playing with these different load balancers just as I try to learn this tech. So maybe if it's of interest, leave us word or comment on the Slack channel, because this keeps coming up for people using Kubernetes on premises. So anything anybody discovers out there in load balancer, if you'd like to see more of this kind of topic brought up, or we can even go back, Dan transitioned, or he transitioned jobs, so that's why he couldn't make it today, but maybe we can bring him back to do a deeper dive, with an expert speaker on the topic, if that's of interest to people. Any final comments on the load balancer subject? Otherwise, I'll move on. Okay, David, do you want to pick it up and cover the new features in the vSphere cloud provider?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, just as an FYI, the cloud provider vSphere we had a release, technically on Friday, and yeah, so it's now 1.2. I just wanted to cover 4 kind of major notable things. There's a bunch of other bug fixes, documentation updates, which are all great, but the 4 I wanted to really touch on, probably one of the more important ones is node deletion. So the CPI now kind of follows convention with the other cloud providers, such that when the vSphere VM is no longer accessible or present, according to vCenter, it's going to trigger a node deletion and remove it from Kubernetes. So that's definitely something to be aware of. There are flags if anyone needs the old behavior to re-enable the old behavior, which is basically leave the Kubernetes node registered there. You can, anyone's interested, there is a flag for it. Just as an FYI, that node deletion is the default behavior, so just be aware of it. There's experimental NSXT support now for load balancers. It's experimental. You have to enable it there's a flag to enable it. There's in the PR, if you're interested in it, there's documentation on how to configure it, set it up, and what's required. The next thing is that there's YAML support for the cloud config. So previously the cloud config was using the old any style configuration, which most other cloud providers use, and now we have support for YAML. And just to let everyone know that the YAML or the any functionality is still there. By default, it's going to try to, whatever cloud config you have, it's going to try to parse it as YAML first. And if it happens to be any, it's obviously not going to work. And it's going to fall back to the old any-based configuration, so that, if everyone has enough time to migrate to YAML, the YAML configuration. We're going to look at creating some new tooling, so that if you did have a old any configuration, that it's going to automatically convert it to to YAML. So, and then the last thing,
maybe before you move on, could you add a little color on why the YAML support was there? Does it enable any new functionality, or were people just complaining about the difficulties of using INI when the rest of Kubernetes is all YAML?
Yeah, so there's kind of a few things. So one, it's a lot of the more complex configurations are easier to express using YAML. And we actually had a number of issues where in the any configuration, we overloaded a bunch of properties that probably shouldn't have been, in order to support, as an example, to support multi-tenancy and multi-vSphere accounts in the CPI. We had to do hacks if you had the old any configuration, which had bracket vCenter, or it was vCenter, and then it had the IP address, in order to support multi-tenancy, because you could potentially have multiple accounts for a given vCenter server. So in order to kind of in that configuration, you'd have a vCenter server, 2 entries with the exact same IP address. And when you actually parse any, that's not allowed because the key is exactly the same. So what we had to do is we had to do things like overwrite that property replace it with like a tenant ID instead, and then have a field within the vCenter any configuration that said this is the actual server, just in order to get uniqueness in that that any tag. So things like that were very, very difficult to express in using any, and so that's why we moved towards that YAML configuration. There were I forgot the gentleman's name who, like, a few people who implemented the NSXT load balances support. They actually had all their configuration based in YAML first, and because we didn't have a YAML configuration that we could like plop into the cloud config, they made efforts to like convert everything to any. And so this basically, it's like, it's a more expressive way of like writing down configuration, and it also happens to fall in line with like the way we deploy pods and stuff using YAML configuration. So that's kind of like the big reason and motivation for doing it.
Yeah, sounds like it also maybe lets you avoid, you know, mental mistakes and things, because you're kind of in the mindset of using YAML all day. It's just like, if, I don't know about the rest of you, but if you're a developer and you work a job in Java for a year and then go back to C++, that is kind of a context shift that you end up really screwing up. And I would never want a job where you really did that flipping back between languages every hour. So maybe YAML is a good thing. Okay, go on. Sorry, I interrupted the train, but you.
No, that's perfectly okay. It's actually, yeah, it's, you know, hopefully there is a, so just as an FYI, there is, for the any configuration, there is in code, there is a deprecation notice saying, hey, you know, like move towards the YAML thing, but like realistically, it's going to be there for like a while. So, but just to make everyone aware that the YAML configuration is like probably the most ideal way of configuring like going forward. So, and then the last item is it's basically for security. So basically the CPI now, the container, when it gets deployed, by default, if you're using the YAML that's available in the repo, the manifests folder that's there, it by default now deploys as non-root. So that's basically for security reasons, to avoid like privilege escalation and that stuff for security. And that's kind of about, those are the kind of the big highlights that I just wanted to point out. And there's a bunch of other fixes and some other features, but yeah, those are like the main ones that really stand out. And that's it.
Okay, thanks, David. And I just put a link to the actual release notes for that release in the chat. So that has the full list. I think it's a pretty big list. So go have a look if, if you're dependent on that. So moving on, the next item on the agenda is these online CNCF conferences. So Miles and I just finished a presentation at what they didn't call it KubeCon, they called it Cloud Native plus Open Source China. And they had 2 or 3 days of talks, that kind of the replacement of what would have been a KubeCon China. And they have published the deck even for people who didn't pay the fee to attend the conference. So far, I haven't seen a publicly available recording link. And I think the CNCF is perhaps trying to fund the foundation partially through charging, for registration at these conferences. So even though I think Miles and I do have a recording of that, I'm in respect to the CNCF, I'm not going to put it out there. I'd expect if they behave like they have in the past, maybe a month from now, they're going to upload that presentation to YouTube. But in the meantime, the deck is there in the agenda notes. And let me just copy it into the chat for people who perhaps don't have the notes open. The content that we covered in that deck was the migration from in-tree to out-of-tree, both for the cloud provider and for storage, moving from the in-tree storage plugin to the CSI. I think there was some material there that is new and hasn't been covered in that level of detail before. And we also did a bit of best practices. Miles, did I leave anything out on that summary of what our talk did?
No, I think that was basically it. That sounds pretty accurate to what we presented.
Okay. So I think for most members of this group, it probably is pretty interesting, and go take a look if you think it might be. Then moving on to the upcoming conference, it's in about 2 weeks. It's the replacement for the originally planned KubeCon Europe. I've listed 4 sessions there that might be of interest to group members. The first one, David, thanks for coming, but you're going to have a detailed topic on the cloud provider. Do you want to say a few words without giving away the whole talk in advance of what you're going to cover there?
Yeah, sure. So basically, the talk covers mainly how to use the multi-tenancy support that was introduced in, I think it was 1.1, but there was a bunch of other features that were added to further enable the multi-tenancy story. And so my talk basically covers like CPI and CSI, and like how you can potentially deploy both the CPI and CSI driver in ways that, could enable, better efficient use, like sharing of resources in vSphere, and as they pertain to Kubernetes clusters. So that's kind of like what the talk focuses on.
Okay, thanks. Then the second one is another session by myself and Miles. They don't like repeat talks, so this is not going to be the same talk we gave in the China event. And we're covering a couple things. One is an intro to the cloud provider and storage. Miles, anything else you want to add to what you did at the beginning of the talk?
No, basically just a comparison between the VCP and the CPI and the CSI, how they're different. And I give a brief overview of the volume migration beta in 1.19, so the move from VCP to CSI, and how we're supporting migrating volumes from the old format into the new format.
Okay, that sounds like great material. And then the second half of that talk is something a little bit different from what we've been talking about so far, and that's running Kubernetes on VMware's desktop hypervisors. That would be Fusion for the Mac and Workstation, which has versions for running on Linux and on Microsoft Windows. And I give kind of an attempt at a live demo of standing up Minikube on top of the Windows desktop hypervisor. I intentionally chose Windows because it's the more difficult and the one that seems to be very infrequently covered in blog posts and things. But I got Kubernetes running on my Windows laptop. I didn't do a video recording of the desktop because in these new online conferences, the bandwidth is challenged. So I did it more screenshot style. But I cover a step-by-step. And I think if you watch that, get the recording and then pause it, it should be reproducible, even though I used Windows. What I did there probably has steps that don't apply to running on Linux. So you just drop them out, but it should be similar enough that you could follow along and get a Minikube Kubernetes stood up on a Mac or a Linux desktop or laptop. Finally, a couple other sessions. We don't have speakers for these in this meeting today, but they sounded interesting. So there's a user panel session which had about 4 different Kubernetes end users. This is not really VMware specific, but I mean, this is a user group, so it's Kubernetes users talking about their experiences and lessons learned. And then finally, there's Kubernetes has a SIG, a special interest group called usability, that is charged with making the product better from the context of making it easier to use. And the chairs or leads of that SIG are presenting a session on research into usability as well as the potential for both code and non-code contributions related to usability. And I think since our group here is user-focused, a lot of these non-code contributions, in order to make Kubernetes usable, the big element here is user feedback. So users have a big part in this. If you're feeling pain and want it to go away, maybe the best way to do that is, well, contribute yourself, or even if you can't contribute, at least let the pain points be known so that the people steering the ship, which is Kubernetes, can do something about it in the long run. If you don't know where the pain and suffering lies or what features are being requested, it's kind of tougher to make good decisions. So this is, I would contend this session is a good start for getting a feedback loop going for between the coders and the users. And there often aren't social situations where this can take place easily, but this seems to be one of them. So with that said, that's the end of the written agenda for today. I'll open the floor up for anything else people want to discuss. Also, there might be some first timers here, so we often would open the floor to people introducing themselves and just give us a flavor, if you choose to, of why you came here or what you'd like to get out of the group, and maybe we can do something about that, or just floor is open to anybody, so just unmute yourself and speak up. If it's a small enough group, we'll try free for all instead of making you raise hands and see how it goes. Okay, we've got dead air.
Hey, my name's Robert Hammond. I'm one of the product managers working on the storage side of VMware. My particular focus is on enabling people to safely back up and restore the data that they've chosen to put into Kubernetes on top of vSphere. My question is, how do we go about increasing engagement in the group? Is it all right to post links to the group on sites like LinkedIn and Twitter and whatnot, and encourage people to sign up and join and contribute?
Yeah, sure. A couple of ground rules. We've had problems with these Zoom meetings with trolls coming in, disrupting meetings. So the directives coming down from the Kubernetes community leadership are that we shouldn't be posting the Zoom link. We make people at least join the list, and then the Zoom link to meetings is posted in there. So it's slight inconvenience, but believe it or not, there are people using Google searches just to find Zoom links and dropping in for their own amusement. I think it's kind of the digital age equivalent to graffiti tagging a wall or a railroad car or something, where, I don't know, who has enough time? Apparently some people do. But other than that, yeah, anything you want to do to promote the existence of the group, how to join, that's all open. You can certainly even post meeting agendas, things like that. But the only limitation is on the Zoom link itself that I'm aware of. The other thing that is a typical thing people run into, the agenda notes document for this, and essentially all documents in the Kubernetes project are gated by group membership. So, in the interest of participation, we let everybody go and have edit rights to this document, but it isn't literally any random anonymous person. The docs are kept, as a Google Doc, and you have to be logged in as that account. And FYI, if you're new to this group, a frequent complaint is someone will register their group membership in a personal or a corporate email, and then flip over to the other one, try to open the doc and report that, hey, I don't have access rights. So just join join the group, and you should have access to it, assuming you are logged into Google using that same account you used to join the group. There is a way on the Kubernetes project, there's a status called being a member, and there is some criteria for doing that. It isn't just click something and you're done. But if you become a member, you kind of will get a blanket access to a lot of shared documents. But Rob, that might be overly long-winded, but I'd say, yeah, if you're helping to build awareness, I'm all for it. And if you are running any other groups and you want me or somebody else to come in and talk about what this group is, you're welcome to contact me, and, you know, given it, I'm generally interested in doing that. So, because I think this group will work better the more participation we get. With regard to content on your particular interest of backup and restore, I think that's of interest to most users. We've had presentations on it in the past. There's a few angles to it of both backing up the Kubernetes metadata, like the Kubernetes config itself, and then backing up the stateful apps you've got going with it. And both of those tend to be of serious interest when you're standing up your own Kubernetes on premises, which is kind of what I think most of the people who come to this group are, that is what they're looking for. And the only thing I mean, you're welcome to even put yourself on the agenda to talk about those kinds of topics. The only caveat being that it's not to be used as a format to promote a product. It should be just general topics like, you know, serving all users regardless of whether they're on pure open source or some commercial product. Talking about just kind of the general requirements is fine, or best practices. And you've crossed the line if you're quoting product numbers and prices. But you know, general topics, yeah, we'd even welcome them for future meetings.
Yeah, so that is actually a follow-on question, in that we are working with open source software vendors to enable their offerings to work with vSphere. But we do have some closed source software vendors that we work with. I think it's like at least 100 different people who sell proprietary backup and recovery software. So it sounds like we should encourage the open source side of the house and remind everyone of the guidelines, that it's a sales pitch is outlined. But like, would a demo for someone work? Like, if
I think especially if the demo is reproducible elsewhere, that's just fine. I mean, if you look at KubeCon talks, half the talks are by people associated getting paid because they're a commercial vendor. You've got, I don't know how many Kubernetes distributions, yet you can manage to put on talks. I mean, because even if I have a commercial Kubernetes distribution, if I give a talk on Kubernetes in general and standing up apps on Kubernetes, that's pretty generic. And, you know, there's a way to give that is of value to users in general. And so long as we respect that, you know, kind of the issue of best practices, meaning that for any production grade deployment of Kubernetes, if you cross into the area of standing up stateful workloads on Kubernetes, there's people, I swear you know, it's new to some people. So I've heard people speculate with crazy talk, you know, as crazy as, gee, it's in my Docker image and I recorded something while this Docker image was running, so it must get saved in the image registry, right? And I mean, obviously anybody who knows how this works knows that isn't true, but there are people who just don't understand fundamentals like that and have, without knowing it, made wrongful assumptions. So really even intro talks like that of how this stuff is working under the covers, because I've run into people who aren't even aware that they should have a backup solution and think somehow that the container magic is going to take care of it for them. And so I think there's a lot of opportunities for vendors to help out on general education, awareness, best practices here. Just resist the temptation to plug a product, and you can still put on good content. And a big thing for vendors, I think, is to let's make this two-way, because it isn't just you monologuing about these great features, but I think that this is so early stage here, running things on Kubernetes, that there's a big opportunity to get feedback from the user community on what their needs are, and to take it the other direction. I mean, there's great technology out there with open source, things like the Valero project and others, but even they, I think, admit that it's early stages for that. They're just getting into the early stages of application keys and things that have been out there a decade in kind of the legacy bare metal and VM solutions for disaster recovery. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for users to help prioritize what vendors do first, because some of these vendor products, I think, are going to be a lot better in 5 years than they are now, even though what's there today is a useful tool.
Okay, so what I'm going to do then is a takeaway is to go back to some of my peers on the storage team, and I think it'd be timely for Miles and myself and a fellow named Gopala to produce some content to show, first of all, like how the VMware storage stack works with Kubernetes, so people can start to, understand, what's going on there. And then we have some partners we're working with who are open source providers, and we might invite them to start to come into these calls and talk about what they're doing with VMware and how they're going about providing their services on top of our platform.
Yeah, I think it's even fair to invite, I think users is often interpreted as the end user, somebody who is standing this up. But often there's an intermediate tier where they have vendors who do things on their behalf. I mean, when it comes to backup and DR, they'll often engage organization-wide with somebody, I don't know, I'll throw a few names out there like Tivoli or Symantec, other names that kind of started in the bare metal world, but they've got an ongoing relationship. And I know, having worked in backup and DR, you don't change vendors there overnight, even in the course of a year or a decade, because they're very sticky, simply because for even legal reasons, you've got to keep these backups online and available sometimes for 4 years. There's HIPAA things, sometimes for 10. Some financials want to keep it essentially forever. And flipping a vendor means that since I still have to keep my legacy inventory of these backups, what you're really asking me to do to flip vendors is to take on 2 vendors simultaneously. So they tend to not go away. And as an organization moves out of bare metal and virtualization into containerized, they aren't going to be able to get a divorce from that vendor who is keeping the massive inventory of their legacy stateful apps. So they're tending to want to stick with whatever backend storage they still had. So this becomes a deal of transitioning. Rob, bottom line is, if you can get those kinds of people invited to hear the presentation, I think it's an interaction between the users and that class of service providers. And I'd welcome that at meetings of this user group, as long as it doesn't turn into product pitches.
I will bring the industry.
Okay, sounds great.
And just to remind everybody, legacy stuff doesn't go away.
I like how you had that at arm's reach.
I
got some other stuff here. Look at this.
I don't think I was alive when that came out.
16-bit C++.
Out in my garage, I could actually produce a floppy disk, but it's in a box somewhere.
Yeah. Well, great. I will I'll go back and start to bring up some stuff and rustle up a few other folks, because I know there's a lot of people at VMware that are interested in this stuff, and there's certainly a lot of customers that are very interested in learning how to be successful as they deploy Kubernetes on top of VMware. And we do have an army of software partners.
Okay, time boxing this, we've got about 15 minutes left. Anybody else want to add something to discuss to the table for discussion? "30 seconds to let you unmute if you have to. Okay, finally, before I wrap up, I'd invite people to put things on the agenda for next month. I haven't actually started that, but sometime in the next 24 hours, I'll put a section in the agenda, Jock, or just scroll it in there. If you don't see the template for the next meeting, you know a next meeting is coming in a month, first Thursday of every month, as always. So just scribble into the agenda notes document what you'd like covered. And even if you don't have a speaker, you can throw it down and give Miles and I a mission to try to get somebody authoritative or knowledgeable, or maybe even sometimes not knowledgeable. We'll find out, but challenge us to get some content for the next meeting, please. Okay, last call. Otherwise, I'm gonna end this early and let you do whatever. Okay, well, thanks for attending the meeting, and we'll see you first Thursday of next month. And final reminder, there are some good sessions at this upcoming KubeCon Europe online conference. Oh, one other thing, that the agenda notes has a link to register for that conference. You have about 24 hours to get a free registration for at least the keynote, and I think what they call the equivalent of the vendor hall or something. You can get that for free in the next 24 hours. After that, you have to pay 75 bucks. And if you want to go to the sessions, I think you pay 75 bucks anyway. We did have a discount link for that, but I got feedback recently that the 20% discount link isn't working, so I won't throw that one out there. But anyway, register for KubeCon Europe. And thanks for coming, and we'll close this. Thanks.
Thank you for putting this out.
Sure.